The morning sun had barely crested the Sierra Nevada when Rebecca Grayson discovered her father lying face down in the orchard, his pruning shears still clutched in his stiffening fingers. And she knew at that moment her entire world had just collapsed like a mine shaft with no timber support. She dropped to her knees beside him, pressing her fingers against his neck, though she already knew what she would find. Nothing, just cooling skin and the terrible stillness that followed death. Her father, Thomas Grayson, had been the heartbeat of this apple orchard in Downeyville, California, and now that heart had stopped beating forever. Rebecca was 20 years old, unmarried, and suddenly alone with 60 acres of fruit trees that needed constant care if they were going to survive another season. The year was 1878, and women did not typically run orchards by themselves. The town would expect her to sell, to find a husband quickly, or to move back east where she had distant relatives who might take her in out of obligation rather than love. But Rebecca had been born in this orchard, had learned to walk between these trees, and had spent every spring of her life watching the blossoms turn to fruit under her father's careful guidance. She would not abandon it now. After the funeral, after the neighbors had brought their casseroles and their thinly veiled suggestions that she sell to one of the larger landowners, after the last sympathetic face had disappeared down the dusty road, Rebecca stood in the orchard with her father's leather work gloves and his pruning shears. The trees needed attention. It was late winter, the critical time for pruning before the spring growth began. Her father had taught her everything about this work, how to cut away the dead and diseased branches, how to shape the tree to allow light and air to reach every part, how to encourage new growth while removing the old wood that would never bear fruit again. She started with the oldest apple tree, the one her grandfather had planted when he first claimed this land. The work was meditative, requiring focus and care. Each cut had to be deliberate, angled properly so water would not collect and cause rot, positioned to encourage the tree to grow in healthy directions. As she worked, she felt her grief transforming into something else, something like determination. These trees depended on her now. They could not speak or ask for help, but they needed her hands to thrive. By the end of the first week, her arms ached from reaching overhead, her fingers were blistered despite the gloves, and she had managed to prune only a fraction of the orchard. At this rate, she would not finish before the sap started rising and the trees began their spring growth. She needed help, but she had no money to hire workers. Her father had poured every cent back into the orchard, investing in new varieties and better equipment. The bank account held barely enough to last her through summer if she was careful. She was standing on a ladder, reaching for a high branch on a pear tree, when she heard the sound of a horse approaching. Rebecca did not climb down immediately. Visitors usually meant more unwanted advice or another offer to buy the property at a price far below its worth. But the horse stopped near her ladder, and a man's voice spoke up. "That is a clean cut. You know what you are doing up there." Rebecca looked down and found herself meeting the eyes of a cowboy she had never seen before. He sat easy in his saddle, a dusty figure with sun-darkened skin and eyes the color of winter sky. His horse was well cared for. His gear showed signs of long use but was maintained with obvious care. He looked to be in his mid-20s, perhaps 24 or 25, with the kind of lean strength that came from hard work rather than simple youth. "I should know what I am doing," Rebecca said, climbing down the ladder with her pruning shears still in hand. "My father taught me everything about these trees before he died 2 weeks ago." Something shifted in the cowboy's expression, a softening that seemed genuine rather than performative. "I am sorry for your loss. Thomas Grayson was your father. You knew him." Met him once, about 3 years back when I was passing through. I was working on a cattle drive that came through Downieville, and I had a problem with my horse. Your father helped me, would not take any payment. Said helping folks was just what people did. The cowboy swung down from his saddle, holding his hat in his hands. My name is Yates Langford. I was riding through again and thought I might stop by, see if Mr. Grayson needed any work done. I did not know he had passed. Rebecca studied him carefully. She had learned to be cautious of strangers, especially men who showed up with convenient stories. But there was something in Yates Langford's eyes that seemed honest, a directness that did not waver when she held his gaze. I am Rebecca Grayson. And as you can see, there is plenty of work to be done. Unfortunately, I cannot afford to pay anyone right now. Yates looked around the orchard at the rows of trees stretching up the hillside, at the pruning that had been completed and the vast amount that remained. How much land? 60 acres. Apples mostly, but also pears, plums, and cherries. All of it needs pruning before spring really sets in. She heard the exhaustion in her own voice and straightened her spine, refusing to appear defeated in front of a stranger. I know something about pruning, Yates said slowly, still looking at the trees. Worked on a ranch in Oregon for a while that had an apple orchard. The foreman taught me the basics. I am no expert like you clearly are, but I can follow instructions and I am not afraid of hard work. I just told you I cannot pay. Room and board would be enough if you have got space, and maybe when the harvest comes in, if there is profit, we could work something out then. He turned back to face her, and Rebecca saw something in his expression she could not quite name. Not pity exactly. Something more like understanding. Truth is, Miss Grayson, I have been drifting for a long time and I am tired of it. I would like to stay in one place for a while, do work that matters, work that builds something instead of just passing through. Rebecca knew she should be more cautious, should ask for references, or at least think about this for more than 30 seconds. But she also knew that she was desperately behind on the pruning, that she needed help, and that something in her gut told her Yates Langford was being honest with her. There is a small cabin behind the main house where my father's workers used to stay when we could afford help. It is clean and dry. I can provide 3 meals a day, nothing fancy. If you are willing to work for that and a potential share of the harvest, then I would be grateful for the help. Yates put his hat back on and nodded once, a decisive gesture. You have got yourself a deal, Miss Grayson. When do we start? Right now, Rebecca said, handing him a spare pair of pruning shears from her work bag. I will show you what needs to be done. They worked through the rest of that day, Rebecca teaching and Yates learning quickly. He had not exaggerated his experience. He understood the basic principles and had the patience to make careful cuts rather than rushing through the work. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows through the orchard rows, Rebecca felt something she had not felt since her father died. Not quite hope, but maybe the possibility of hope. That night, she cooked a simple dinner of beans and cornbread, and Yates ate in the main house kitchen. The small cabin had a stove, but Rebecca found herself wanting company, wanting to hear another human voice in the house that had become so terribly quiet since her father's death. Tell me about the drifting, she said, surprising herself with the directness of the question. What makes a man spend years moving from place to place? Yates was quiet for a long moment, his fork resting against his plate. Running, mostly. From things I did, from who I used to be. Nothing terrible, no crimes or anything like that. But I made mistakes, hurt people I cared about through my own stupidity and pride. Figured it was easier to keep moving than to face what I had done. And now I am tired of running. Tired of waking up in different places and not remembering where I am. Tired of having nothing that matters, nothing that lasts. He looked up at her, and in the lamplight his eyes held a kind of weary honesty. Your father showed me a kindness I did not deserve when I was here before. I had lost my temper with my horse, was about to take a switch to him for something that was my own fault. Your father stopped me, talked me down, explained what I was doing wrong. He showed me respect I had not earned, and it stuck with me. Made me think about the man I wanted to be versus the man I was being. Rebecca felt something tight in her chest loosen slightly. He was good at that, seeing the best in people, even when they could not see it in themselves. They fell into a routine over the following days. They would start at dawn, when the air was still cold and mist hung in the low places. Rebecca taught Yates the finer points of pruning, how to read a tree's growth pattern, how to encourage fruiting spurs while removing water sprouts. He was a quick study, and more than that, he seemed to genuinely care about doing the work right. As they worked side by side, they talked. Yates told her about growing up in Nevada, about a father who drank too much and a mother who died young. About learning to cowboy because it was the only work he could find. About long cattle drives and bunkhouse fights, and the endless empty spaces of the West. But he also told her about moments of beauty, about sunrises over desert mesas, about the satisfaction of good work well done, about horses he had known and respected. Rebecca, in turn, told him about her life in the orchard, about her mother who had died giving birth to a stillborn son when Rebecca was 10, about the years after when it had been just her and her father building this place together, about her dreams of expanding the orchard, of developing new varieties, of making this place something that would last for generations. I want to create something that matters, she said one afternoon as they took a break in the shade of a massive oak at the edge of the orchard. Not just for me, but for this whole valley. Good fruit, grown with care, that people can depend on. My father used to say that an orchard was an act of faith. You plant trees that will not reach full production for years. You care for them through drought and disease, and you trust that the future will be better than the present. That is a kind of faith I can understand, Yates said. He was cleaning his pruning shears, working the pivot point with a small brush to remove sap and debris. Building towards something instead of running from something. I like that. By the end of March, they had pruned the entire orchard. Rebecca walked through the rows, inspecting their work, and felt a fierce pride. The trees looked healthy, properly shaped, ready for the spring growth that was already beginning. Tiny green buds were swelling on the branches, and soon the whole hillside would be covered in blossoms. Yates had not mentioned leaving. He had repaired the cabin's roof where it had been leaking, fixed several broken fence posts, and cleaned out the irrigation channels that carried water from the creek to the orchard. He worked as if this place was his own, with a care and attention that spoke of investment rather than just doing a job. One evening in early April, when the apple trees were covered in clouds of white blossoms and the air smelled like honey and promise, Rebecca invited Yates to walk with her through the orchard after dinner. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold, and the bees were making their last rounds of the day. "It is beautiful," Yates said softly, standing in the middle of a row of blooming trees, "like something out of a dream." "It only lasts about a week," Rebecca said. "Then the petals fall and the real work begins. Thinning the fruit, watching for pests and disease, making sure each apple has enough space and resources to grow properly. But this moment, when everything is in bloom and full of possibility, this is what keeps me going through the hard parts." Yates turned to look at her, and something in his expression made Rebecca's breath catch. "I need to tell you something, Rebecca. May I call you Rebecca, not Miss Grayson?" "Yes," she said, though her heart was suddenly beating faster. I came here planning to stay maybe a few weeks, just long enough to repay the kindness your father showed me. But now," he paused, seeming to search for the right words, "now I do not want to leave. Being here, working with you, taking care of these trees, it has given me something I have been looking for my whole life without knowing what it was. Purpose, I guess. A sense of home, and more than that." Rebecca waited, not trusting herself to speak. "More than that, I have come to care for you. Deeply. I know I am just a drifting cowboy with nothing to my name except a horse and a saddle. I know you deserve better than someone with my past. But if you would have me, if you would be willing to take a chance on me, I would spend the rest of my life working to be worthy of you in this place." The words hung in the air between them, surrounded by the scent of apple blossoms and the soft sounds of evening. Rebecca had not expected this, though looking back she realized she should have. She had seen the way Yates looked at her when he thought she was not paying attention, had felt the charge in the air when their hands accidentally touched while working. She had told herself not to hope, not to imagine a future that might not be possible. But now he was offering her exactly that. "A future, together. You said you have a past you are running from," Rebecca said carefully. "You said you hurt people. I need to know what that means before I can answer you." Yates nodded as if he had expected this. "Fair enough. You deserve the whole truth." He took a breath, looking up at the darkening sky before meeting her eyes again. "I was engaged once, back in Nevada. Her name was Catherine, and she was the daughter of the ranch owner I worked for. She was beautiful and kind, and when she said she loved me, I felt like the luckiest man alive. But I was young and stupid and insecure. I got jealous over nothing, started arguments over imagined slights, tried to control who she talked to and where she went. I never raised a hand to her, never that, but I hurt her with my words and my suspicion." He paused, his jaw tight with remembered shame. "She broke off the engagement, and she was right to do it. I was not ready to love someone properly, was too broken up inside from my own childhood to know how to treat someone with respect. Her father fired me, ran me off the ranch, and I have been drifting ever since. That was 6 years ago. I was 19 years old and thought I knew everything. Took me years to understand what I had done wrong, to see how my own pain was poisoning everything I touched. And now," Rebecca asked quietly, "have you changed, or are you still that person?" "I hope I have changed. I have worked on it, thought about it, tried to understand why I acted that way so I would never do it again. But I cannot prove it with words, Rebecca. I can only show you through my actions. I can only promise that I will respect you, trust you, and never try to control or diminish you. If you see me slipping into old patterns, you call me on it and I will listen. That is all I can offer. That and my heart, which is completely and entirely yours if you want it." Rebecca looked at this man who had appeared in her orchard at exactly the moment she needed help, who had worked beside her with patience and care, who had shared his worst moments without making excuses. She thought about the weeks they had spent together, about the easy conversations and comfortable silences, about the way he looked at her like she was something precious and strong at the same time. "I care for you too," she said, and watched his whole face transform with hope. "I did not plan to. I was not looking for love or romance. I was just trying to survive, to save my father's orchard, to make it through each day. But you showed up, and you helped me, and you listened to me, and you made me laugh even when I thought I would never laugh again. So yes, Yates Langford, I am willing to take a chance on you, on us." He reached for her hands, holding them gently in his own work-roughened palms. "I will not let you down, Rebecca, I swear it." She stood on her toes and kissed him, there in the orchard under the blooming trees with petals drifting down around them like spring snow. It was not her first kiss, but it was the first one that felt like a promise, like the beginning of something that could last forever. They married in June, a simple ceremony in the Downeyville church with a handful of neighbors as witnesses. Rebecca wore a dress she had sewn herself from pale blue cotton, and Yates bought a new shirt and spent an hour trying to get his hair to lie flat before giving up. The local preacher performed the ceremony, and afterward there was cake and coffee at the church social hall. "You are sure about this?" Yates asked her quietly as they stood together greeting well-wishers. "There is still time to change your mind." Rebecca squeezed his hand. "I have never been more sure of anything. You are stuck with me now, Yates Langford." He grinned, and she realized it was the first time she had seen him smile so freely, without shadows in his eyes. "Best thing that ever happened to me, getting stuck with you." They spent their wedding night in the main house, in the bedroom that had been Rebecca's since childhood. It felt strange and wonderful all at once, having Yates there with her, beginning this new chapter of their lives. He was gentle and patient, and Rebecca felt herself falling even more deeply in love with this man who treated her with such care. In the morning, they woke to the sound of birds singing and got dressed to go check on the orchard. The young apples were developing well, small green spheres that would swell and ripen through the summer. They would need thinning soon, removing the excess fruit so the remaining apples could grow larger and sweeter. "This is going to be a good year," Yates said, examining a cluster of young fruit. "I can feel it." Rebecca leaned against him, his arm coming around her shoulders automatically. "We are going to make it a good year, together." The summer was hot and demanding. They spent long days thinning fruit, irrigating during the dry spells, watching for signs of disease or pest damage. Yates proved himself invaluable, not just as a worker, but as a partner. He had ideas about improving the irrigation system, suggestions for marketing their fruit in Sacramento and San Francisco. He rode into town regularly to check prices and make contacts with buyers. In the evenings, they would sit on the porch of the main house and watch the sun set over the orchard. Sometimes they talked about their plans for expansion, about saving enough money to buy the adjacent property that would give them access to more water. Sometimes they talked about nothing important at all, just sharing the comfortable companionship of two people who genuinely enjoyed each other's company. One evening in late July, as they sat watching the last light fade from the sky, Yates said something that made Rebecca turn to look at him in surprise. "I was thinking about what you said, that first day we worked together. About how pruning is like cutting away the past to make room for new growth. I remember. Well, I was wondering if you would be willing to prune away my past with me. Really prune it away, I mean." He took her hand, his thumb rubbing gently over her knuckles. "I have been carrying so much dead wood, so many old regrets and mistakes. Working here with you, building this life together, it has shown me what growth can look like when you are not weighed down by all that old debris. But I still have moments where those old patterns of thinking try to creep back in. The jealousy, the insecurity, the fear that I am not good enough." Rebecca listened carefully, hearing the vulnerability in his voice. "I want to be better for you, Rebecca. I want to cut away all those diseased parts of myself and grow into the man you deserve. And I need your help to do it, just like those trees need a skilled hand to show them which way to grow. If you see me slipping, if you see those old patterns coming back, I need you to tell me. Prune away my past and grow with me. That is what I am asking." Rebecca felt tears prick her eyes, moved by his honesty and his trust. "We will prune each other's pasts," she said softly, "because I have my own dead wood too, my own fears and insecurities. The fear that I cannot do this alone, that I will fail and lose everything my father built. The fear that I am not enough, that I will let everyone down. We will help each other cut away those fears and grow toward the light together." Yates pulled her close, kissing the top of her head. "That is the best deal anyone has ever offered me." The harvest that year was abundant. The apples were crisp and sweet, the pears perfectly ripe, and the plums so juicy they stained your fingers purple. Yates had arranged sales to merchants in Sacramento, and they made enough profit to pay off the remaining debts on the property and put some money aside for future improvements. As autumn painted the orchard in shades of gold and red, Rebecca realized she had not had her monthly courses in some time. She waited a few more weeks to be certain, consulting with the doctor in town, before telling Yates the news. She planned it carefully, waiting until they were in the orchard together, standing under the ancient apple tree that had been planted by her grandfather. It seemed appropriate somehow, telling him about new life in this place where her family's roots ran so deep. "I have something to tell you," she said, taking his hands in hers. Yates looked at her, concern flickering across his features. "What is wrong?" "Nothing is wrong. Everything is right." She smiled, feeling joy bubble up inside her. "We are going to have a baby, Yates. Next spring, around the time the trees bloom, we will be parents." For a moment he just stared at her, as if his mind was having trouble processing the words. Then his face broke into the biggest smile she had ever seen, and he swept her up in his arms, spinning her around before setting her down gently, suddenly worried about being too rough. "A baby. We are having a baby." He looked dazed, happy, terrified, and thrilled all at once. "We are having a baby," Rebecca confirmed, laughing at his expression. Yates dropped to his knees, pressing his face against her still flat stomach. "Hello in there, little one. This is your father. I promise I am going to do better for you than my father did for me. I am going to love you and your mother with everything I have. I am going to teach you about these trees and this land, and I am going to make sure you know every single day how much you are wanted and valued." Rebecca ran her fingers through his hair, her heart so full it felt like it might burst. This was what happiness felt like. Not just contentment or satisfaction, but pure, radiant joy. The winter was mild that year, and they spent it preparing for the baby. Yates built a cradle from apple wood, sanding it smooth and carving delicate flowers into the headboard. Rebecca sewed tiny clothes and blankets, her hands busy while her mind wandered to what their child might be like. Would they have Yates's blue eyes or her brown ones? His height or her stubbornness? In March, when the first blossoms were beginning to appear on the apple trees, Rebecca went into labor. It was long and difficult, lasting through the night and into the next day. Yates held her hand through all of it, bringing her water, wiping her forehead with cool cloths, talking to her in a low, steady voice that helped anchor her through the waves of pain. Finally, as the sun was setting and the evening birds were beginning their songs, their son was born. He came into the world squalling indignantly, his tiny face red and wrinkled and absolutely perfect. "A boy," the midwife announced, placing the cleaned and swaddled baby in Rebecca's arms. "A healthy boy with good lungs." Rebecca looked down at her son and felt her entire world shift and reorganize itself around this tiny person. His eyes were scrunched shut, his little fists waving in the air, and she loved him with an intensity that was almost frightening in its completeness. "What should we name him?" Yates asked, kneeling beside the bed and reaching out to gently touch his son's tiny hand. The baby immediately gripped his finger and Yates looked like he might cry. "Thomas," Rebecca said without hesitation. "Thomas Langford for my father. He should carry that name forward." "Thomas Langford," Yates repeated, testing the sound of it. "I like that. I hope I can be half the man your father was, little Thomas. That would be enough." They settled into the rhythms of new parenthood, learning together how to care for this tiny person who depended on them for everything. It was exhausting and wonderful, terrifying and joyful, and Rebecca could not imagine going through it without Yates beside her. He was a devoted father from the very beginning, rising in the night to help with feedings, walking the floor with Thomas when he was fussy, talking to him constantly about the orchard and the trees and all the things they would do together when he was older. Spring turned to summer, and they worked the orchard with Thomas sleeping in a basket in the shade. He was a good baby, content to watch them work and listen to the sounds of the orchard around him. By harvest time, he was sitting up on his own, reaching for apples with his chubby hands and grinning his gummy smile. The harvest was even better than the year before. Word had spread about the quality of the Grayson Langford orchard fruit, and they had buyers lined up before the apples were even fully ripe. Yates hired temporary workers to help with the picking, and Rebecca supervised the sorting and packing while Thomas sat in his basket and babbled at everyone who passed. As autumn settled over the orchard once again, Rebecca and Yates stood together on the porch, Thomas asleep in his father's arms. The trees were bare now, their leaves fallen and their fruit all picked, and they looked stark against the evening sky. But Rebecca did not see emptiness when she looked at those bare branches. She saw potential, the promise of next spring's growth, the endless cycle of death and renewal that made the orchard what it was. "You remember what you asked me," Rebecca said softly, not wanting to wake the baby. "About pruning away your past and growing with me." "I remember," Yates said. "Best decision I ever made asking you that." "I think we have done it," Rebecca continued. "Look at us now. Look at what we have built together. A thriving orchard, a beautiful son, a life that matters. We pruned away our pasts, all that dead wood and diseased thinking, and we grew something healthy and strong in its place." Yates shifted Thomas gently to one arm so he could put the other around Rebecca's shoulders, pulling her close. "You pruned me when I showed up here, whether you realized it or not. Cut away everything that did not serve growth, showed me which way to reach for the light. I was a broken man running from his past, and you helped me become someone who could build a future instead." "We helped each other," Rebecca corrected. "That is what love is, I think. Two people helping each other grow toward the light, pruning away the parts that do not serve, supporting each other through every season." They stood there in comfortable silence, watching the stars come out one by one over the orchard. Inside, the fire crackled warmly, and dinner was waiting on the table. Tomorrow they would start preparing the orchard for winter, protecting the young trees from frost, and planning next year's planting. But tonight, in this moment, everything was exactly as it should be. The years passed in the gentle rhythm of orchard life. Thomas grew from a baby to a toddler to a young boy who loved nothing more than climbing the apple trees and helping his parents with the work. He had Yates's blue eyes and Rebecca's dark hair, and he had inherited both of their stubborn determination. When Thomas was 3, Rebecca gave birth to their second child, a daughter they named Caroline after Yates's mother. She was different from Thomas in every way, quiet where he was boisterous, content to sit still where he needed constant motion. But she shared the same love for the orchard, and by the time she could walk, she was following her parents through the rows, asking questions about everything she saw. The orchard continued to thrive under their care. Yates's innovations in irrigation had made them less dependent on rainfall, and Rebecca's careful cultivation had developed several unique varieties of apples that commanded premium prices. They were able to buy the adjacent property, expanding their holdings and securing better water rights. They hired permanent workers, treating them fairly and paying them well, and built a reputation as good employers in a region where labor disputes were becoming increasingly common. One spring evening when Thomas was 8 and Caroline was 5, the family was walking through the blooming orchard together, as they did every year when the trees reached peak bloom. It was a tradition now, marking the moment when winter's dormancy gave way to spring's promise. "Tell us the story," Thomas begged, as he did every year. "Tell us about how you and Papa met." Rebecca looked at Yates and smiled. He rolled his eyes in mock exasperation, but she could see the fondness in his expression. He loved this story as much as the children did. "Well," Rebecca began, settling onto a grassy spot between the trees and pulling Caroline into her lap while Thomas sprawled beside them. "It was right after your grandfather, Thomas, died, and I was trying to prune the whole orchard by myself. I was tired and scared, and I did not know how I was going to manage everything alone. And then your father rode up on his horse, looking dusty and travel-worn, and he asked if I needed help." "And you said yes," Caroline interrupted, knowing the story by heart but loving to hear it anyway. "I said yes," Rebecca confirmed. "Even though I could not pay him, even though I did not know him, something told me I could trust him, and I was right." "Tell the part about what Papa said," Thomas urged. "The part with the pruning." Yates laughed and reached over to ruffle his son's hair. "That comes later in the story. Be patient." They continued the tale with both parents contributing parts, telling their children about those early days of working together, about falling in love, about deciding to build a life together. When they got to the part about Yates asking Rebecca to prune away his past and grow with him, both children sighed happily. "That is the best part," Caroline said, snuggling deeper into her mother's lap. "Like magic." "Not magic," Yates corrected gently. "Just love and hard work and commitment. Those things together can transform anything, even a broken-down cowboy into a husband and father." "You were not broken down," Rebecca protested. "You were wounded. There is a difference. Broken things cannot be fixed, but wounds can heal if they are cared for properly." Thomas, who had been lying on his back looking up at the blossoms, suddenly sat up with a serious expression on his young face. "Papa, do you still have bad days? Days when the old thoughts try to come back?" It was a perceptive question, more mature than his 8 years would suggest. Yates considered it carefully before answering, treating his son's question with the respect it deserved. "Sometimes," he admitted. "Not often anymore, but sometimes. Usually when I am very tired or worried about something. Those old patterns of thinking are like deep grooves in my mind, and sometimes I find myself slipping into them without meaning to. But your mother helps me, and I have learned to recognize when it is happening so I can correct course before I do any damage." "How does Mama help?" Caroline asked. "She tells me the truth, even when it is hard to hear," Yates said, reaching across to take Rebecca's hand. "She calls me out when I am being unreasonable or unkind. She does not let me get away with bad behavior just because we are married. And she reminds me, over and over, that I am not that scared, angry young man anymore, that I have grown beyond who I used to be." Rebecca squeezed his hand. "And your father does the same for me. When I get too worried about the orchard, when I start obsessing over everything that could go wrong, he reminds me to have faith, to trust that we have built something strong enough to weather storms." They sat there together as the light faded, surrounded by blossoms and the sound of bees finishing their work for the day. This was what they had built together, Rebecca thought. Not just an orchard and a home, but a family. A place where wounds could heal and love could grow, and children could learn what commitment really meant. By the time Thomas turned 15, he was doing full adult work in the orchard. He had developed his father's steady patience and his mother's eye for detail. and he was already talking about agricultural school, about learning new techniques they could bring back to improve the orchard. Caroline, at 12, showed less interest in the business side but had developed her grandmother's artistic talents, sketching the trees in all seasons and creating beautiful botanical illustrations. The orchard had grown beyond anything Rebecca had imagined in those early days of grief and determination. They now had over 100 acres, employed 20 permanent workers, and shipped fruit as far as Denver and Portland. But success had not changed the fundamental nature of who they were. They still worked in the orchard themselves every day, still knew every tree individually, still approached their work with the reverence and care that Thomas Grayson had instilled in his daughter all those years ago. One afternoon in late summer, as Rebecca and Yates were working together to thin peaches in the newer section of the orchard, Yates suddenly stopped working and turned to look at his wife. "What is it?" Rebecca asked, seeing the intensity in his expression. "I just wanted to tell you something," he said. "I wanted to tell you that I am happy, completely, entirely, thoroughly happy. There is not a single thing I would change about my life, not one decision I would make differently, not one moment I would trade away. You gave me that, Rebecca. You and this orchard and our children. You gave me a life worth living." Rebecca set down her pruning shears and went to him, wrapping her arms around his waist and resting her head against his chest. She could hear his heartbeat, steady and strong, the same heartbeat that had beaten beside hers for almost 20 years now. "You gave me the same thing," she said. "I was drowning in grief and responsibility, and you showed up like an answer to a prayer I had not even known I was praying. We saved each other, Yates. We pruned away each other's pasts and grew something beautiful together." He kissed her then, there in the peach orchard with the sweet smell of ripe fruit all around them and the sound of their workers laughing somewhere in the distance. It was not a desperate kiss or a passionate one, though there was still plenty of passion in their marriage. It was a kiss of deep, abiding love, the kind that had weathered years and hardship and joy and come out stronger for all of it. When Thomas was 17 and about to leave for agricultural school in Berkeley, the family gathered for one last walk through the orchard before he left. It was spring again, the apple trees in full bloom, and the tradition that had begun when the children were small continued now that they were nearly grown. "I am going to miss this," Thomas said, looking around at the rows of blooming trees. "The campus will have trees, but it will not be the same as these trees, the ones I have known my whole life." "They will be here when you come back," Rebecca assured him. "Trees are patient. They wait." Caroline, who at 14 was becoming more reserved and thoughtful, spoke up quietly. "I have been thinking about something. About the story you and Papa always tell us, about pruning away the past and growing together. I think I understand it better now than I did when I was little." "What do you understand?" Yates asked, always interested in what his perceptive daughter had to say. "I used to think it meant forgetting about the past entirely, just cutting it away like a dead branch and never thinking about it again. But that is not what you meant, is it? The past is still there, still part of the tree. You can see where the cuts were made, where the old growth was removed. The point is not to pretend it never happened. The point is to not let it control your future growth, to learn from it and use that knowledge to grow in better directions." Rebecca felt tears prick her eyes. Her daughter had understood completely, had grasped something that many adults never figured out. "That is exactly right," she said. "The scars from pruning never completely disappear. You can always see where a branch was removed if you look closely enough. But those scars are part of the tree's history, evidence of the care it received, proof that someone loved it enough to guide its growth. Your father and I both carry scars from our pasts. The difference is that we do not let those scars define us anymore. We acknowledge them, learn from them, and keep growing anyway. Yates put his arms around both his children, pulling them close. "You two are the best thing we ever grew," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "Better than any apple or pear. You are what happened when your mother and I decided to prune away our pasts and grow together. You are the fruit of that decision." Thomas groaned. "Papa, that was terrible. You cannot make fruit metaphors about your children." "I just did," Yates said, grinning, "and I will do it again. You are both ripe with potential, especially you, Caroline. You are the apple of my eye." "Stop," Caroline laughed, pushing away from him. "That is even worse." They walked through the orchard, teasing and laughing, and Rebecca thought about how this moment was its own kind of bloom. Not the literal blossoms on the trees, though those were beautiful too, but the blooming of a family fully realized, of children becoming adults, of a life well lived bearing fruit in ways she could never have anticipated. Thomas went off to school and thrived there, writing home letters full of excitement about new grafting techniques and pest management strategies. Caroline continued her art, developing a style that combined scientific accuracy with genuine beauty, her illustrations of the orchard's trees becoming locally famous. Rebecca and Yates continued their work, their partnership as strong in their 40s as it had been when they first married. They moved through the orchard like dancers who knew each other's steps perfectly, anticipating needs, supporting each other, working together toward common goals. One evening, as they sat on the porch watching another sunset paint the sky in brilliant colors, Rebecca said something she had been thinking about for a while. "You ever wonder what would have happened if you had not stopped here that day? If you had just kept riding, kept drifting, never turned down that road into my orchard?" Yates was quiet for a moment, rocking slowly in his chair. "I try not to think about it," he finally said, "because I cannot imagine my life without you in it. Cannot imagine not knowing our children, not having built this life together. The thought of it makes me feel like I am standing at the edge of a very dark void." "I feel the same way," Rebecca said, "but sometimes I think about it anyway, just to remind myself how fortunate we are. How many small choices led to us finding each other. If my father had not helped you that first time you came through, if you had not remembered his kindness, if you had arrived a week earlier or later when I was in town instead of in the orchard, if I had been too proud or too scared to accept your help, any of those things could have changed everything. But none of them did," Yates said. "We found each other at exactly the right moment when we both needed what the other had to offer. You needed help with the orchard, and I needed a place to stop running. It was not luck or coincidence. It was meant to be." Rebecca was not sure she believed in fate or destiny, but she believed in this. She believed in the love she and Yates had built together, in the family they had created, in the orchard that had brought them together and sustained them through the years. That was real and solid and true in ways that abstract concepts of fate could never be. When Thomas graduated from agricultural school 3 years later, he came home with a degree, a head full of new ideas, and a young woman named Sarah, whom he introduced as his fiancée. She was a professor's daughter, smart and capable, who had grown up in Sacramento but fell in love with the orchard the moment she saw it. "This place is magical," she said during her first visit, standing in the middle of the apple rows with blossoms falling around her like snow. "Thomas told me about it, but I did not really understand until I was here." "It is not magic," Rebecca said, though she smiled as she said it. "It is years of hard work and careful attention, but I suppose if you put in that kind of work, what you get back can feel like magic." Thomas and Sarah married the following spring in the orchard, of course, standing under the oldest apple tree to exchange their vows. Caroline served as her brother's witness, and Rebecca watched her children with pride and gratitude. This was continuity, she thought. This was what they had built. Not just trees and fruit, but a legacy that would extend beyond their own lives. Sarah proved to be a valuable addition to the family business. She had studied accounting and brought much-needed organization to their financial records. She also had ideas about expanding into preserves and dried fruit, value-added products that could extend their season and increase profits. Within 2 years, they had a small production facility and were shipping Grayson Langford preserves throughout California. Caroline, meanwhile, had her botanical illustrations published in a San Francisco magazine, bringing attention to her work and the orchard both. She was not interested in marrying, she told her parents. She was happy with her art and her life helping with the orchard when she was needed, but pursuing her own path the rest of the time. Rebecca and Yates supported her completely, understanding that not everyone needed the same things to be fulfilled. When Thomas and Sarah announced they were expecting a baby, Rebecca felt the years collapse in on themselves. She remembered being 20 and pregnant with Thomas, remembered the fear and excitement and overwhelming love. Now she would be a grandmother, and the wheel would turn another generation. The baby was born in the winter, a little girl they named Rose. She was pink and perfect, and when Rebecca held her for the first time, she looked up at Yates with tears in her eyes. "We have done well," she said. "Look at what we have created." "We have," he agreed, his own eyes damp. "We pruned away our pasts and grew something that will last beyond us. That little girl will walk this orchard someday and know that her great-grandfather Thomas started it, that her grandparents saved it, that her parents expanded it. She will be part of this continuity whether she knows it or not." As the years continued to pass, more grandchildren arrived. Thomas and Sarah had 3 children in total, Rose and later twin boys named Jack and Daniel. Caroline eventually surprised everyone by falling in love with a visiting journalist who came to write an article about her botanical art. His name was Michael, and while Caroline made it clear she had no interest in a traditional marriage, the two of them built a partnership that worked for them, living part-time in San Francisco and part-time at the orchard. Rebecca and Yates aged gracefully, their hair turning gray and their faces developing the deep lines that came from years of working outdoors. But they were healthy and active, still working in the orchard most days, still walking through the rows in spring when the trees bloomed, still deeply in love after more than 40 years of marriage. On their 40th anniversary, Thomas and Sarah organized a celebration, inviting friends and workers and business associates from throughout the region. Tables were set up under the apple trees, laden with food made from orchard fruit. There was apple pie and pear tart, plum wine and cherry preserves. The children ran between the trees, playing games, while adults talked and laughed and celebrated. As the sun began to set, Thomas called for everyone's attention. He stood with his arm around Sarah. Their children gathered near and raised his glass. "I want to propose a toast," he said. "To my parents, Rebecca and Yates Langford, who built something remarkable here. Not just an orchard, though this is certainly a remarkable orchard, but a family, a community, a legacy of care and commitment and love. They taught Sarah and me what a good marriage looks like, what it means to work together toward common goals, how to weather hardship and celebrate joy. They taught Caroline to be true to herself, to forge her own path even when it was not the expected one. And they are teaching their grandchildren those same lessons every day." He paused, and Rebecca could see he was fighting emotion. "But most importantly, they showed us that it is never too late to start over, to choose growth over stagnation, to prune away the things that no longer serve you and reach toward the light. My father came here as a drifting cowboy running from his past. My mother was a grieving daughter trying to save her father's life work. Together, they created something neither could have built alone. That is what I want all of us to remember and celebrate today, the power of two people choosing to grow together. Everyone raised their glasses, and Rebecca felt Yates's hand find hers under the table, their fingers interlacing automatically after all these years. She looked around at the gathering, at the children playing and the adults talking, at the orchard stretching up the hillside behind them, and felt complete satisfaction. After the party, when everyone had gone home and it was just Rebecca and Yates again, they walked through the orchard one more time. It was something they had done countless times over the years, but it never got old. The trees were familiar friends, each with its own shape and personality, each telling its own story through the pattern of its branches. "You remember that day I showed up here?" Yates asked as they walked. "How scared I was that you would turn me away." "You did not look scared," Rebecca said. "You looked confident, capable, like you belonged here already." "That was an act," Yates admitted. "Inside I was terrified. I wanted so badly to stay to stop running, but I was convinced I did not deserve it, that I was too broken for someone like you to want around." Rebecca stopped walking and turned to face him. Even with his gray hair and weathered face, she could still see the young man who had ridden into her orchard all those years ago. "I saw through the act, you know. I saw the fear and the hope and the desperation. That is why I said yes. Because I recognized something of myself in you. I was scared too, terrified that I would fail, that I was not strong enough or smart enough to do what needed doing. We saved each other, Yates. We were each other's answer." He pulled her close, and they stood there under the stars, surrounded by the trees they had tended together for 4 decades. The orchard was quiet now, the day's work done, resting until tomorrow when it would begin again. "Prune away my past and grow with me," Yates said softly, repeating those words he had spoken so long ago. "That was the best thing I ever said to anyone. And saying yes was the best decision I ever made," Rebecca replied. They stood there a while longer, then slowly made their way back to the house. Tomorrow there would be work to do. There was always work to do in an orchard. Trees to check, fruit to monitor, workers to supervise, grandchildren to spoil. But tonight, in this moment, everything was perfect. The seasons continued to turn as they always did. Spring blossoms gave way to summer fruit, which gave way to autumn harvest, which gave way to winter's rest. Through it all, Rebecca and Yates worked together, their partnership as essential to the orchard's success as sun and water and soil. They watched their grandchildren grow, teaching them about the trees just as they had taught their own children. Little Rose showed particular interest, following Rebecca around and asking endless questions about pruning and grafting and pest control. By the time she was 10, she could identify every variety of apple in the orchard and knew the proper pruning technique for each one. "She reminds me of you," Yates said one day, watching Rose carefully trim a water sprout from a young tree. "That same intensity, that same need to understand how everything works." "She reminds me of your mother," Rebecca said. "The way you described her, determined, careful, loving in a fierce way." Yates smiled. "My mother would have loved you, would have loved all of this. She wanted so much to build something that mattered, but life never gave her the chance. I like to think she would be proud, seeing what we have created here." "I am sure she would be," Rebecca said, taking his hand. When Rebecca turned 65, she started training Rose in earnest, teaching her all the specialized knowledge that could not be learned from books. How to tell when an apple was at peak ripeness just by looking at it. How to identify disease in its earliest stages, before visible symptoms appeared. How to read a tree's growth pattern and anticipate what it would need in the coming season. Rose absorbed it all eagerly, filling notebooks with sketches and observations, asking questions that showed genuine understanding. "Do you think she will take over someday?" Yates asked one evening. "Not just help, but really run the place." "I think she might," Rebecca said. "Thomas loves the orchard, but Sarah loves it more as a business than as a living thing. Rose has that connection to the trees themselves, that understanding that they are not just crops but partners. She has what it takes." Yates nodded slowly. "Then we have succeeded at something even more important than building a successful orchard. We have passed on the knowledge and the love. That is a rare thing, Rebecca. Most people do not get to see their life's work continue beyond them." The years were kind to both of them, all things considered. They had their aches and pains, the inevitable slowdowns that came with age, but they remained active and engaged. They still walked the orchard most days, though not as far or as fast as they once had. They still made decisions about planting and harvesting, though they relied more heavily on Thomas and Sarah to handle the physical demands. On their 50th anniversary, the celebration was smaller and quieter than the one 10 years before. Just family this time, gathered in the main house for dinner and conversation. The grandchildren, all teenagers now except for the youngest twins who were 11, took turns sharing their favorite memories of their grandparents. Rose, now 15 and seriously considering agricultural school like her father before her, spoke about learning to prune, about how her grandmother had taught her that it was not just about cutting away dead wood, but about understanding the tree's essential nature and helping it become more fully itself. "That is what you two have shown all of us," Rose said, looking at Rebecca and Yates with mature eyes. "That growth is not about becoming someone different, but about becoming more truly yourself, about cutting away the parts that do not serve and nurturing the parts that do. You have done that for each other, and you have taught us to do it for ourselves." After dinner, after the dishes were cleared and the younger grandchildren had been sent to bed, and the older ones had wandered off to talk among themselves, Rebecca and Yates sat on the porch together. It was spring again, and the orchard was in full bloom, the air heavy with the scent of apple blossoms. 50 years, Rebecca said wonderingly. Half a century since we stood in that church and promised to love each other for the rest of our lives. Best 50 years anyone could ask for, Yates said. I meant what I said back then, you know, about spending my life proving I was worthy of you. You proved that long ago, Rebecca said. Proved it every day in 1,000 small ways, the way you treated the workers with respect. The way you loved our children. The way you listened when I needed to talk and stayed quiet when I needed silence. The way you never took your anger or frustration out on me or the kids, even when you were feeling those things. You became the man you wanted to be, Yates. You did that. We did it together, he corrected. Like everything else. They sat in comfortable silence, rocking slowly, watching the stars come out over the orchard. The trees were dark shapes against the night sky, their blossoms pale ghosts in the darkness. Tomorrow those blossoms would begin to fade, petals falling to carpet the ground, and the slow process of fruit development would begin. It was a cycle they had witnessed 50 times together now, and it never lost its power to move them. Rebecca and Yates both lived well into their 70s, remaining active and engaged with the orchard and their family until the very end. When Yates finally passed, peacefully in his sleep at the age of 76, Rebecca grieved deeply but without regret. They had been given more time together than many couples ever dreamed of, and they had used that time well. She continued to work in the orchard after his death, finding comfort in the familiar rhythms of the work, in the solid reality of the trees that had witnessed their entire life together. Rose, now in her early 20s and graduated from agricultural school, worked beside her, providing quiet companionship and capable assistance. "Tell me about when you first met Grandpa," Rose said one day as they worked together, pruning a section of older apple trees. Rebecca smiled, having told this story countless times but never tiring of it. "He rode up on his horse and complimented my pruning. I was trying to save the orchard by myself after your great-grandfather died, and I was not sure I could do it. Then there he was, offering to help for nothing more than room and board and a share of the harvest if there was one. I had no reason to trust him, but somehow I knew I could." "And then he asked you to prune away his past and grow with him," Rose prompted, knowing the story as well as her own name. "Eventually, yes. Not right away. First we worked together, learned each other, figured out if we could really build something together. The words came later, but the sentiment was there from the beginning. Two people choosing to reach toward the light together, supporting each other's growth." Rose was quiet for a moment, making a careful cut on a complicated branch structure. "I hope I find something like that someday. Not necessarily marriage, but that kind of partnership. That sense of building something together that matters." "You will," Rebecca assured her. "You are already building it, here in this orchard. Whether you share it with a romantic partner or friends or colleagues or family, you will build something meaningful because you understand what truly matters. Care, attention, patience, commitment. Those are the things that make anything grow, whether it is trees or businesses or relationships." Rebecca lived to see Rose take over full management of the orchard, to see her great-grandchildren running through the rows of apple trees just as her children and grandchildren had done before them. She lived to see the orchard celebrate its 100th anniversary. 4 generations of family gathered to honor the legacy that Thomas Grayson had started, and that she and Yates had saved and expanded. On a warm spring evening, surrounded by blooming apple trees and 4 generations of family, Rebecca Grayson Langford passed peacefully away at the age of 79. She died as she had lived in the orchard, with the scent of blossoms in the air and the sound of her family's voices all around her. Her last conscious thought was of Yates, and of the day he had ridden into her orchard and changed everything, and of how very, very lucky she had been to say yes to his offer of help, to his love, to the life they had built together. They buried her next to Yates under the oldest apple tree in the orchard, the one her grandfather had planted all those years ago. Rose planted a new tree beside their graves, a seedling grown from seeds of the original tree, carrying the legacy forward into yet another generation. The orchard continued to thrive, as orchards do when they are cared for with love and attention. Rose ran it with the same combination of business sense and genuine affection for the trees that her grandmother had shown. She eventually married a fellow agricultural scientist, and together they had 3 children who grew up climbing the same trees their great-great-grandfather Thomas had planted, learning the same lessons about growth and care and commitment that had been passed down through the generations. And every spring, when the apple trees bloomed and covered the hillside in white and pink petals, the family would gather for their traditional walk through the orchard. They would tell the story of how it all began, of Rebecca trying to save her father's legacy, of Yates riding in and offering to help, of 2 wounded people choosing to prune away their pasts and grow together toward the light. The story was legend now, the foundation narrative of the family, the explanation for how they had all come to be standing in this beautiful place, surrounded by these thriving trees. The words Yates had spoken so long ago became a kind of family motto, repeated at weddings and anniversaries and moments of transition. Prune away my past and grow with me. It was a reminder that growth required letting go of what no longer served, that love was an active choice rather than a passive feeling, that the best things in life were built slowly and carefully through years of patient attention. The Grayson Langford orchard continued for generations, each adding their own innovations and improvements while maintaining the core values that Rebecca and Yates had established. The trees they had planted lived for decades, producing fruit that fed thousands, providing beauty and shade and habitat for countless birds and insects, standing as living monuments to the power of two people choosing to build something together. And if sometimes, on spring evenings when the blossoms were at their peak and the air was heavy with their perfume, workers claimed to see two figures walking hand in hand through the rows of trees, well, that was surely just a trick of the light, just shadows moving in the dusk. But Rose, when she heard these stories, would smile and say nothing, thinking of her grandparents and the love that had quite literally taken root in this soil, growing and thriving and bearing fruit long after they were gone. That was the real legacy, she knew. Not the acreage or the profit margins, or even the quality of the fruit, though all of those things mattered. The real legacy was the example they had set, the proof they had provided that broken things could be mended, that scared people could find courage, that two people choosing to grow together could create something that would outlast them by generations. That was what mattered. That was what would endure.